History often remembers the leaders of the Third Reich as monolithic figures of terror, defined solely by their political crimes. However, behind the propaganda and the military uniforms lay individuals with bizarre, often pathological hobbies and fetishes. These were not merely interests, they were obsessions that often mirrored their distorted worldviews. By examining these private manias, we gain a chilling insight into the banality of evil. Today, we explore 20 of the most strange and unsettling obsessions of the Nazi elite, based strictly on historical records and memoirs of those who knew them best. 1. Adolf Hitler, Megalomania in Stone, and the Disney Paradox. Adolf Hitler's most famous obsession was not with the present, but with a stone-carved future. Alongside his architect Albert Speer, Hitler spent countless hours hunched over miniature models of Germania, his envisioned world capital. His fetish for architecture was rooted in the theory of ruin value. He demanded that all state buildings be constructed so that, even thousands of years later, their ruins would resemble the grandeur of ancient Rome. This was an obsession with immortality through debris. However, there was a softer yet stranger side to his private life. Hitler was a massive fan of Walt Disney. In 2008, sketches of characters from Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs and Pinocchio, signed with the initials AH, were discovered in Norway. Hitler viewed Disney's work as the pinnacle of filmmaking. He owned a private copy of Snow White, which was banned for the German public, and watched it repeatedly. This stark contrast, the man planning a global genocide while sketching Dopey the dwarf, remains one of the most haunting paradoxes of his personality. 2. Hermann Goering, the magpie of the Reich. If Hitler was an ascetic, Hermann Goering was a glutton for luxury. His primary obsession was art, but his collecting was more akin to pathological looting. Goering's estate, Karen Hall, was stuffed with thousands of stolen masterpieces. He would often sit in a silk robe, running a handful of uncut diamonds and emeralds through his fingers like a medieval sultan. This tactile fetish for gemstones was noted by several foreign diplomats. Beyond jewels, Goering had a bizarre obsession with dressing up. He owned hundreds of custom-designed uniforms, some featuring flamboyant furs and medals of his own invention. He even kept lion cubs as pets, parading them around his mansion to impress guests. This constant need for theatrical display was a way to mask his deepening addiction to morphine, a habit he developed after being wounded in 1923. 3. Heinrich Himmler, the architect of mysticism and the chicken farmer logic. Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsfuhrer SS, remains one of the most enigmatic and chilling figures of the era. His obsessions were not merely pastimes. They were the foundation of a new, dark state religion. To understand Himmler, one must look at his early life as a failed chicken farmer. He carried the cold, clinical logic of animal husbandry into his management of human populations. He viewed the selection of people with the same detached obsession a breeder uses to cull a flock. This biological fetish led to the creation of the Lebensborn program, where he obsessively monitored the hair color, eye shade, and lineage of infants, treating human life as a laboratory experiment. However, his most profound obsession lay in the occult. Himmler was convinced that the history of the German people was being suppressed by the Church. To recover this lost greatness, he founded the Ahnenerbe, an ancestral research organization. This was no small hobby. It was a massive, state-funded institution. Himmler sent expeditions to the furthest corners of the globe. In the Himalayas, his researchers obsessively measured the skulls of Tibetans, searching for the remnants of a lost Aryan master race. He funded searches for the Holy Grail, inspired by the medieval legends of King Arthur. His private fetish was the Wewelsburg Castle. He spent millions of marks transforming this triangular fortress into a Nordic Camelot. In the basement, he created the crypt, a ritual chamber with perfect acoustics where he believed he could communicate with the spirits of ancient Germanic kings. He was particularly obsessed with King Heinrich the Fowler, claiming in private circles that he was the monarch's literal reincarnation. Every year, on the anniversary of the king's death, Himmler would retreat into silent meditation at the ruler's tomb, a ritual he performed with fanatical devotion. Furthermore, Himmler had a bizarre obsession with witchcraft. He ordered the collection of all available records regarding the witch trials of the Middle Ages. He believed that the women burned as witches were actually Germanic wise women whose ancient knowledge of nature and medicine was being systematically destroyed. This led to the creation of the H-Sonderauftrag, H Special Task, a massive archival project that catalogued over 30,000 cases of witchcraft, a hauntingly detailed obsession with the supernatural and the macabre. 4. Joseph Goebbels, the master of image and the 30,000-page shadow. Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, was a man consumed by a different kind of fetish, the fetish of the self. His primary obsession was graphomania, a pathological need to write down every thought, interaction, and emotion. Starting in 1923 and continuing until the very day of his suicide in 1945, Goebbels maintained a diary that would eventually exceed 30,000 handwritten pages. He did not write these for himself alone. He wrote them for a future that he believed he would own. He obsessively polished his entries, often spending hours in the middle of the night, rewriting sections to make his role in history seem more central. This was a man obsessed with his own shadow, curating a legacy while the world burned around him. Another of Goebbels' deep-seated obsessions was the film industry. This went far beyond his official duties. He was a cinema addict who watched at least one, and often 2 or 3 movies every night in his private screening room at his villa. His fetish was for the star system. He obsessively controlled the lives of German actresses, intervening in their careers, their marriages, and their personal lives. He would personally vet the scripts not just for political content, but for aesthetic perfection. His obsession with the UFA studios made him a shadow director of an entire nation's dreams. He was fascinated by Hollywood's glamour, secretly admiring the very American films he publicly condemned. Goebbels also possessed a physical obsession rooted in his own deep-seated insecurities. Suffering from a club foot, he was obsessively focused on how he was photographed and filmed. He studied camera angles with the precision of a diamond cutter, ensuring that no image would ever betray his physical disability. He fetishized the perfect Aryan form in propaganda art, precisely because he lacked it himself. This psychological projection turned his private insecurity into a national obsession with physical aesthetics, leading to the cult of the perfect body in German cinema and sculpture. His life was a constant obsessive performance, a meticulously crafted lie documented in tens of thousands of pages of ink. 5. Reinhard Heydrich, the virtuoso of death and the fencing obsession. Reinhard Heydrich, often called the Hangman or the Blonde Beast, was perhaps the most terrifyingly perfect figure of the Nazi elite. His obsessions were a chilling blend of high culture and extreme physical competition, creating a duality that baffled even his colleagues. Heydrich was a world-class fencer, but for him, fencing was not a mere sport. It was a psychological fetish for dominance. He didn't just want to win. He needed to humiliate his opponents. Witnesses recalled that if Heydrich lost a match, he would fall into a state of icy, silent rage that could last for days. He applied this same fencing logic to his work in the SD and Gestapo, searching for a weak opening in his enemies and lunging with lethal precision. His second, and perhaps more surprising, obsession was the violin. Heydrich was an accomplished musician, born into a family where music was a religion. His father was an opera singer and composer. He played with a delicate, soulful touch that often moved his listeners to tears. There is a haunting historical record of Heydrich performing sentimental classical pieces at social gatherings, only to go to his office the next morning and sign orders for the mass execution of thousands. This wasn't a mask. He genuinely loved the music. This ability to compartmentalize high art and industrial-scale murder is one of the most disturbing examples of the dual soul often found in the regime's leadership. Furthermore, Heydrich had a secret obsession with aerial combat. Despite being one of the highest-ranking officials in the Reich, he would secretly sneak away to fly combat missions as a Luftwaffe pilot on the Eastern Front. This was a direct violation of Hitler's orders, as Heydrich was too valuable to lose. However, his fetish for personal danger and his need to prove he was a warrior rather than just a bureaucrat drove him to take these risks. He was eventually shot down behind enemy lines and had to be rescued, an event that only fueled his ego. His life was a constant, obsessive race to prove he was the ideal man, a pursuit that made him cold, detached, and ultimately one of the most efficient architects of the Holocaust.
6. Rudolf Hess, the hypochondriac of the heavens. Rudolf Hess, the deputy Führer, lived in a world dominated by two bizarre obsessions: astrology and pathological hypochondria. While other leaders obsessed over power or art, Hess was obsessed with the purity of his own body and the alignment of the stars. He was a man who refused to eat anything that wasn't biodynamic or organic, long before these terms became popular. He was so terrified of being poisoned by modern chemicals or impure food that he brought his own specially prepared meal boxes to banquets at the Reich Chancellery, a habit that deeply annoyed Hitler. Hess's obsession with his health reached the level of a fetish for alternative medicine. He surrounded himself with a small army of homeopaths, herbalists, and magnetic healers. He famously had his bed placed in a specific alignment to avoid Earth rays, and allegedly slept with magnets under his mattress to align his life force. This obsession with biological purity was the personal, neurotic root of his broader ideological obsession with racial purity. For Hess, the state was like a body that needed to be cured of parasites through mystical and pseudo-scientific means. However, his most fateful obsession was with astrology and prophecy. Hess would not make a major decision without consulting the horoscopes. He was deeply influenced by the ideas of geopolitician Karl Haushofer, but he interpreted them through a veil of mysticism. In 1941, this obsession drove him to one of the strangest acts of the war, his solo flight to Scotland. Hess believed that the stars were aligned for a messianic peace mission. He convinced himself that he was destined to unite the Aryan brothers of Germany and Britain. He even consulted astrologers to pick the exact date and time for his takeoff to ensure the best possible celestial influence. When he landed in Scotland and was promptly arrested, the British found his pockets full of homeopathic remedies and charts of the stars, the remnants of a man whose obsessions had finally disconnected him from reality. 7.
Albert Speer, The Prophet of Ruins and The Cathedral of Light. Albert Speer, Hitler's personal architect and later Minister of Armaments, possessed an obsession that was both intellectual and deeply unsettling. His primary fetish was the theory of ruin value, Ruinenwert theory. While most architects design buildings to last as long as possible in their prime state, Speer was obsessed with how his buildings would look thousands of years after the fall of the Third Reich. He used special materials and avoided steel reinforcements so that, in the distant future, his structures would collapse into noble ruins, much like those of ancient Greece or Rome. This wasn't just a design choice. It was a pathological obsession with monumentalism and the aesthetics of decay. He wanted the Reich's collapse to be as magnificent as its existence. Another of Speer's visual obsessions was the Cathedral of Light, Lichtdom. During the Nuremberg rallies, he created a fetishistic display of power using 130 anti-aircraft searchlights pointed vertically into the night sky. This created an architecture of light that substituted stone for beams of energy. For Speer, this was the ultimate expression of his obsession, a structure that was immense and awe-inspiring, yet completely untouchable. This display is still studied by stage designers today, but for Speer, it was a way to hypnotize the masses and fulfill his own need for godlike creation. Even during his 20 years in Spandau prison after the war, Speer's obsessive nature didn't fade, it simply shifted. He developed a bizarre hobby of walking around the world within the confines of the prison garden. He meticulously calculated the distances he walked each day and mapped them onto a global atlas. Over the years, he traveled mentally from Berlin to Baghdad, across Asia, and into North America, all while pacing in circles behind stone walls. This mental obsession allowed him to escape a reality he had helped create, proving that his mind always functioned through rigid, obsessive structures.
8. Julius Streicher, The Whip and the Pornography of Hate. Julius Streicher, the Gauleiter of Franconia and publisher of the notorious newspaper Der Stürmer, possessed obsessions that were so vulgar they disgusted even other high-ranking Nazis like Goering. Streicher's primary fetish was pornographic anti-Semitism. He didn't just spread political hate. He was obsessed with racial defilement, Rassenschande. He spent his days collecting thousands of bizarre and grotesque caricatures and reports of sexual crimes, which he published in his paper. Historians note that his obsession had a clear psychological sexual component. He derived a perverse pleasure from documenting and imagining the very acts he claimed to despise. His office was filled with files that resembled a dark, pathological collection of fantasies rather than political documents. Streicher's second obsession was more physical and public: his leather whip. He was almost never seen without a hippopotamus hide whip, which he carried everywhere like a theatrical prop. This wasn't for decoration. He used it to intimidate subordinates and even citizens on the streets of Nuremberg. He had a fetish for physical dominance and enjoyed the aura of the beast that the whip provided. He would often crack it during speeches or meetings to emphasize his points. This behavior was so erratic and thuggish that he was eventually removed from his official posts, but his obsession with his image as a punisher remained until his execution. Furthermore, Streicher was a compulsive collector of myths. He was obsessed with blood libel, the medieval myth that certain groups used ritual blood. He built a massive archive of these fables, treating them as scientific facts. He would spend hours lecturing anyone who would listen on the occult properties of blood. This combination of sexual deviancy, physical aggression symbolized by the whip, and a fanatical devotion to dark folklore made Streicher one of the most disturbed and universally loathed individuals in the Nazi hierarchy. His obsessions were not hidden. They were the very engine of his public life. 9. Robert Ley, the drunken architect of joy and the concrete leviathans. Robert Ley, the head of the German Labor Front, DAF, was a man of profound contradictions, driven by a dual obsession: chronic alcoholism and a fetish for utopian engineering. Ley was functionally an alcoholic throughout his entire career, a fact known to everyone in the Nazi inner circle. However, his addiction didn't slow his fanatical drive to build. He was obsessed with the concept of strength through joy, Kraft durch Freude, a program designed to control every second of a worker's leisure time. His most visible obsession was the construction of Prora, a massive resort on the island of Rügen. Stretching over 4.5 kilometers, it was intended to house 20,000 workers at once. Ley's fetish for gigantism meant that everything had to be the largest in the world: the largest ships, the largest spas, the largest halls. This was his way of buying the loyalty of the masses through concrete and steel. Ley's second obsession was the Ordensburgen, order castles. These were massive, fortress-like schools designed to train the future elite of the party. He was obsessed with medieval Teutonic aesthetics, combining them with modern, cold-blooded indoctrination. He spent millions of marks on these castles, treating them as his private kingdoms where he could play the role of a grand master. His obsession with perfection and order was a tragic irony, given that his private life was defined by drunken brawls and emotional instability. Even at the end of the war, his delusions remained. He proposed bizarre death ray weapons and impossible scientific solutions, proving that his mind, clouded by alcohol and ideology, had completely lost touch with the laws of physics and reality. 10. Joseph Mengele, the genetic fetish and the aesthetic of evil. Joseph Mengele, the angel of death, is a figure whose obsessions represent the darkest point of human history. Unlike other leaders who sought land or wealth, Mengele's fetish was for biological secrets. He was obsessed with the idea of unlocking the genetic code to ensure the infinite multiplication of the Aryan race. This wasn't science. It was a pathological, pseudo-scientific mania. His primary target was twins. He tracked them with the obsession of a collector, keeping detailed notebooks filled with measurements, eye colors, and bone structures. For Mengele, human beings were not people, but biological material meant to satisfy his curiosity. He believed that by studying twins, he could find a way to make every German woman give birth to multiples, thereby winning the demographic war.
Mengele's second obsession was more subtle: a fetish for aristocratic cleanliness and decorum. Even in the horrific conditions of a concentration camp, Mengele was always impeccably dressed in a tailored uniform, white gloves, and polished boots. He maintained a calm, almost polite demeanor while performing his selections. This was a psychological shield. He saw himself as a gentleman scientist performing a noble duty. He had a bizarre obsession with heterochromia, different colored eyes, and would collect eyes of various colors like a macabre lepidopterist collects butterflies. Like Heydrich, Mengele was also a fan of classical music and philosophy. He would often hum opera tunes while working, a habit that witnesses found more terrifying than any scream. This duality, the sophisticated intellectual who possessed a PhD in anthropology and a medical degree, yet used his knowledge to commit atrocities, highlights his obsession with a higher purpose that completely bypassed human empathy.
His life in hiding after the war in South America was also marked by a continued obsession with his work, as he reportedly spent his final years still writing pseudoscientific treatises, unable to let go of the dark fantasies that had consumed his soul. 11. Baldur von Schirach, the romantic fetish for youth and the cult of poetry. Baldur von Schirach, the leader of the Hitler Youth and later the Gauleiter of Vienna, was a man whose primary obsession was the aesthetic idealization of youth. For Schirach, the youth of Germany were not just future soldiers, but a living artistic project. He had a pathological fetish for rituals, flags, and mass choreography. He spent years obsessing over the perfect uniform and the most emotionally stirring campfire songs. His goal was to create a new aristocracy based on physical beauty and ideological purity. This wasn't just political indoctrination. It was a deeply personal, almost sensual obsession with the heroic image of the young German male, which he promoted through thousands of photographs and films. His second, more private obsession was poetry. Schirach considered himself a great romantic poet, a bridge between the classical German traditions of Goethe and the brutal reality of the National Socialist movement. He published several volumes of poetry, including The Flag is More Than Death, which were mandatory reading for millions. His fetish for verse was his way of sanctifying the regime's violence. Even when he was overseeing the deportation of tens of thousands of people from Vienna, he would spend his evenings writing flowery, sentimental stanzas about the beauty of the Danube and the destiny of the soul. This obsession with a romantic, poetic reality allowed him to ignore the suffering he caused, viewing himself as a misunderstood artist in a world of harsh politics. 12. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the fetish of the scar and the silence of the woods. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, who succeeded Heydrich as the chief of the RSHA, was a man of imposing physical presence and dark, silent obsessions. One of his most visible fetishes was the Schmisse, dueling scars on his face. In the tradition of Austrian and German student corps, these scars were a badge of honor, a sign of manliness and courage gained through ritualistic saber dueling. Kaltenbrunner was obsessively proud of these disfigurements, viewing them as a symbol of his elite status and his warrior soul. He would often tilt his head in photographs to highlight the jagged lines across his jaw and cheek, a psychological fetish that connected him to a violent, archaic past. Kaltenbrunner's second obsession was isolated hunting and nature preservation. Despite being responsible for a vast network of terror and bureaucracy, he was a recluse at heart. He had a fetish for the purity of the mountains and would spend weeks in remote alpine lodges hunting large game. His obsession with the hunt was a direct extension of his professional life. He viewed the state's enemies with the same cold, predatory detachment as the stags he shot in the woods. Witnesses at his trial noted that he seemed more concerned about the decline of German wildlife than about the human lives he had destroyed. Finally, Kaltenbrunner had a physical obsession that manifested as pathological chain smoking. He was almost never seen without a cigarette, often smoking up to 100 a day. This was a compulsive, nervous habit that intensified as the Reich crumbled. His yellow-stained fingers and the constant cloud of smoke around him became part of his dark, fetishized persona, the silent, smoking executioner who operated in the shadows. He was obsessed with secrecy, maintaining a fortress of silence around his work, and he destroyed as many documents as possible at the end of the war to ensure his private manias would never be fully understood by history.
13. Joachim von Ribbentrop, the champagne salesman's aristocratic fetish. Joachim von Ribbentrop, the foreign minister of the Reich,
was a man consumed by a singular, pathological obsession: social status and the imitation of aristocracy. Ribbentrop was not born into the nobility. He was the son of a career soldier. His von was acquired through a dubious adoption by a distant titled aunt, a move he obsessively pursued to scrub away his middle-class origins. This aristocratic fetish made him the laughingstock of the old German nobility and even his own party colleagues, like Goebbels, who mocked his desperate need to be seen as a gentleman. He obsessed over every detail of diplomatic protocol, demanding that his staff treat him with the reverence of a prince. His second, more practical obsession was wine and champagne. Before entering politics, Ribbentrop was a successful wine salesman, and he never truly let go of this identity. He possessed an almost sensory fetish for the finest French vintages. Even as Europe was being torn apart by war, Ribbentrop was obsessively concerned with the liquidation of French wine cellars, not for the state, but for his own private collection and as gifts to influence others. He viewed himself as a connoisseur of high culture, using his knowledge of champagne as a tool to navigate the elite circles of London and Paris. This obsession with bubbles and titles was his way of masking a deep-seated inferiority complex, leading him to behave with an arrogance so extreme that it frequently alienated the very foreign leaders he was supposed to negotiate with. 14. Arthur Seyss-Inquart, the Alpinist of legal terror. Arthur Seyss-Inquart, the Reichskommissar of the occupied Netherlands, was a man of cold, intellectual manias. His primary physical obsession was alpinism and mountain climbing. A dedicated hiker and climber, he spent his private time obsessively conquering the peaks of the Austrian Alps. For Seyss-Inquart, the mountains were not a place of leisure, but a place of vertical order and lonely struggle. He fetishized the physical hardship of the climb, viewing it as a metaphor for the struggle of the Germanic soul. Even during the peak of his administrative terror, he would escape to the heights, obsessed with the silence and the absolute control that the mountain peaks provided. His second, more chilling obsession was legalistic perfectionism. As a trained lawyer, Seyss-Inquart had a pathological fetish for the letter of the law. He did not see himself as a criminal, but as a meticulous administrator of new justice. He was obsessed with ensuring that every act of confiscation, deportation, and execution was backed by a precise, albeit perverted, legal decree. He spent hours refining the wording of his orders to ensure they were lawfully sound within the Nazi framework. This obsession with legal form allowed him to maintain a sense of personal integrity while overseeing the destruction of an entire nation's civil rights. He was the bureaucratic alpinist, climbing over the lives of millions with the same methodical, step-by-step precision he used to scale a mountain face. 15. Hans Frank, the King of Poland and the chess obsession. Hans Frank, the Governor-General of occupied Poland, lived a life of grotesque luxury in the Wawel Castle in Krakow. His primary obsession was a fetish for stolen art, specifically the works of the Italian Renaissance. Frank was not just a looter. He was a self-styled connoisseur who viewed himself as a modern-day Medici. His most intense obsession was with Leonardo da Vinci's Lady with an Ermine. He stole it from the Czartoryski Museum and hung it in his private office, often spending hours staring at the painting while signing decrees that led to the destruction of the very culture he claimed to admire. This obsession with high beauty was a psychological shield, allowing him to believe he was a refined European intellectual rather than a brutal administrator. His second, more intellectual obsession was competitive chess. Frank was a fanatic of the game and considered himself a master strategist. He spent vast amounts of state funds to organize international chess tournaments in Krakow during the height of the war. He would invite grandmasters to his castle, treating them with royal honors while the city outside was starving. For Frank, chess was a metaphor for the new order he was building, a world of cold, black and white logic where every move was calculated and every piece was expendable. He obsessed over game theory and would often replay famous matches late into the night, seeking a perfection in the 64 squares of the board that he could never achieve in the chaotic reality of his administration.
16. Otto Skorzeny, the commando fetish and special effects. Otto Skorzeny, the man famously dubbed the most dangerous man in Europe, possessed an obsession that was ahead of its time, a fetish for commando technology and gadgetry. Skorzeny was obsessed with unconventional warfare, but his interest went beyond strategy into the realm of a gearhead. He spent countless hours personally testing silenced pistols, specialized diving equipment, and explosive devices. He was a pioneer of what we would now call special ops, but for Skorzeny, it was an aesthetic and technological fetish. He loved the theater of war, and his missions, such as the rescue of Mussolini, were designed as much for their cinematic impact as for their military value. He was obsessed with his own image, carefully maintaining his scarred hero persona, a result of a dueling scar similar to Kaltenbrunner's. His second obsession was sabotage as an art form. During the Battle of the Bulge, Skorzeny launched Operation Greif, where he obsessed over every detail of making German soldiers look and act like Americans. He didn't just give them uniforms. He insisted they learn American slang, mimic the way Americans smoked, and even carry specific brands of U.S. cigarettes. This fetish for deep cover and imitation was almost pathological. Skorzeny was a man who lived for the stunt, a psychological thrill-seeker who viewed the entire war as a series of high-stakes special effects. After the war, this obsession continued as he allegedly worked for various intelligence agencies, always seeking the next gadget or covert mission, proving that his true fetish was the adrenaline of the shadow war. 17. Martin Bormann, the Brown Eminence and the Data Fetish. Martin Bormann, the powerful private secretary to Hitler, had an obsession that made him the ultimate desk killer, a fetish for administrative control and paperwork. Bormann was not a flamboyant leader. His mania was for the archive. He was obsessed with being the only filter between Hitler and the rest of the world. He kept a massive, meticulously organized system of files on every party member, tracking their finances, their scandals, and their weaknesses. This was his database of power. He was a man who found a perverse satisfaction in the cold reality of a spreadsheet. He would spend 16 to 18 hours a day in his office, obsessed with the purity of the process. His second, more bizarre obsession was agricultural land management. Bormann was a failed farmer, much like Himmler, and he maintained a lifelong fetish for German soil. He managed Hitler's private estate at Obersalzberg with the obsession of a micromanager. He personally oversaw the planting of every tree and the layout of every farm on the mountain. He was obsessed with a utopian agrarian ideal, believing that the future of the Reich lay in a return to the soil. He would write long, angry memos about the correct way to breed cattle or manage a farm, even as the Soviet army was closing in on Berlin. This obsession with ordering the earth was his way of imposing his will on nature, a reflection of his pathological need for absolute, suffocating control over everything and everyone. 18.
Karl Dönitz, the mathematical fetish of the gray wolves. Karl Dönitz, the Grand Admiral of the U-boat fleet and Hitler's eventual successor, possessed an obsession that was as cold and deep as the Atlantic, a fetish for naval mathematics and tonnage war, Tonnagekrieg. Dönitz did not view the sea as a battlefield of heroes, but as a giant equation. He was obsessed with the statistical kill ratio, the exact amount of shipping tonnage his submarines had to sink daily to starve Britain into submission. He spent his days and nights hunched over charts and slide rules, treating his sailors like variables in a formula. This mathematical mania led to the creation of the Wolfpack tactics, where he attempted to manage a chaotic ocean through rigid radio-controlled precision. His second obsession was iron discipline and naval etiquette. Dönitz was a man of extreme, almost monastic austerity. He had a fetish for the Prussian sailor ideal, demanding absolute, unthinking obedience from his crews. He obsessed over the smallest details of life on a submarine, not out of care for the men, but out of a need for total systemic efficiency. He even maintained this obsession during his time in Spandau prison after the war, where he behaved as if he were still on the bridge of a ship, refusing to speak to lower-ranking prisoners. His life was a constant attempt to reduce human complexity to a set of naval regulations and cold numbers, a psychological barrier that protected him from the reality of the lives he sent to the bottom of the ocean.
19. Ferdinand Porsche, the fetish of mechanical gigantism. Ferdinand Porsche, the brilliant automotive engineer, was driven by an obsession that turned his genius into a tool of destruction, a fetish for mechanical gigantism. Porsche was obsessed with creating the ultimate machine, but his definition of ultimate often leaned toward the impossible. This led to his most bizarre creation, the Maus tank. Weighing 188 tons, it was a mechanical monster that was practically useless in real combat. It was too heavy for bridges and consumed astronomical amounts of fuel. For Porsche, however, the Maus was a technical fetish. He obsessed over its complex gasoline-electric transmission and its massive armor, ignoring the tactical reality of the war. He wasn't interested in a working tank. He was interested in a super machine that fulfilled his personal mania for engineering extremes. Porsche's second obsession was speed and efficiency in design. This manifested in his work on the people's car, Volkswagen, and his racing cars, but during the war, it turned into a fetish for industrial perfection. He would spend hours debating the curve of a fender or the efficiency of an air-cooled engine while using forced labor to build his prototypes. This obsession with pure engineering allowed him to disconnect from the moral consequences of his work. He saw the world as a giant workshop where he could pursue his mechanical fantasies, subsidized by a regime that shared his obsession with bigger, faster, and stronger. His life was a testament to how a passion for technical excellence can become a pathological fetish when detached from human ethics. 20. Ernst Udet, the cartoon pilot and the fatal adrenaline. Ernst Udet, the highest-ranking ace of WW1 to survive, and a key figure in the Luftwaffe, was a man consumed by the fetish of life as entertainment. Udet was a celebrity pilot, a stunt flyer, and a socialite. His primary obsession was American popular culture, especially cartoons and comics. Much like Hitler's love for Disney, Udet was obsessed with the fast-paced, colorful world of animation. He spent his nights in a haze of alcohol, surrounded by comic books and sketching his own caricatures. He viewed the entire Nazi regime and the coming war as a thrilling movie
in which he was the lead actor. His fetish for adrenaline drove him to perform dangerous aerobatics at public events, always seeking the next high to escape the boredom of his administrative duties. His second, darker obsession was self-destruction through excess. Udet's life was a chaotic mix of binge drinking, womanizing, and an addiction to various stimulants. He was a man who couldn't face the cold reality of the industrial slaughter he was supposed to organize. His obsession with his public hero image was a mask for a deep-seated depression. When the Luftwaffe began to fail on the Eastern Front and the movie turned into a nightmare, Udet's obsessions collapsed. In his final days, he was surrounded by empty bottles and sketches of his own demise. He committed suicide in 1941, leaving behind a note that blamed the regime for betraying his dream. His life was the ultimate example of a man whose obsessions with fantasy and thrill blinded him to the horror he helped create. Our journey through these 20 profiles reveals a chilling truth. The leaders of the Third Reich were not the supermen their propaganda claimed they were. Behind the rigid uniforms and the terrifying authority lay a collection of deeply flawed individuals driven by bizarre, often pathetic obsessions. Whether it was a fetish for medieval ruins, a pathological need to document every second of life in a diary, or an escape into the world of Hollywood cartoons, these manias served as a psychological shield. They allowed these men to disconnect from the horrific reality they were creating, turning the world into a private laboratory for their own distorted fantasies. Understanding these private obsessions doesn't diminish their crimes. It reveals the banality of evil in its most intimate and disturbing form. Now, we want to hear from you. Out of these 20 figures, which one's obsession surprised or unsettled you the most? Was it the Butcher of Prague playing the violin, or the Deputy Führer following the stars to Scotland? Do you believe these private manias were the primary cause of their descent into madness, or were they just symptoms of an already broken ideology? Write your thoughts in the comments below. Also, let us know which of these 20 personalities deserves a full, deep-dive documentary of their own. We read every comment, and your choice will determine our next major investigation.